Good morning. Oh, look at that. That was a really nice verbal response. Um, I was talking with a group who was enjoying breakfast just a few minutes ago, and I said, wow, this is some very studious breakfast eating. Everybody was sitting on the same side of the table, facing the same direction, eating in almost meditative silence. And so I'm pleased to see that that same studious attention has come into the room this morning. Everybody's very focused, very serious. I like it. So for those of you whom I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Chelsea Reed, and I am the Prevention Education Specialist at the Violence Intervention and Prevention Center. The VIP Center is a campus community resource, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that resource in just a few moments this morning. I want to first thank you all for coming to this morning's program. You are obviously here by choice, volunteering to give your time to this important documentary and to the important dialogue and idea exchange we're going to have afterwards. So before we get started, I want to make sure we acknowledge and thank the campus coalition that brought the Unslut Project documentary and Emily Lindin to campus. Were it not for UK Libraries, the College of Social Work, the Office of LGBTQ Resources, and the Office of Institutional Diversity, we would not be able to have this program. So thank you so much to those offices. As we get started this morning, I want to make sure that everybody knows and is aware we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, which includes within that spectrum sexual bullying. We're also going to be looking at and discussing incidents of sexual assault and rape, and we're going to be talking about the implications to the individuals and to society tied to those acts of violence. And if you hear those words and those ideas and you feel a little overwhelmed, it is because they are overwhelming ideas. And I mention that because I want everybody in this room to feel empowered to practice good self-care. So if at any point in the program you need to kind of relax, take a beat, or step out, please feel welcome to do so. I can promise you that nobody is going to notice, and if they do, they're just going to think you're grabbing a drink of water or going to the restroom. So feel welcome to take care of yourself as needed. And speaking of self-care, I want to talk about a resource for care that we have here at UK, and that is the VIP Center, the center that I work for and that I've mentioned a couple of times this morning. For those of you who may not be familiar, the VIP Center is a confidential campus community resource. We serve students, faculty, and staff. I like to highlight that so that folks know that it is truly an inclusive resource. We serve all facets of campus. And we serve people in different ways. So we do offer direct advocacy and resource connectivity to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, but we also offer those advocacy services to those who are supporting people within their circle who have been impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. We are also proud to be home of the Green Dot Active Bystander Intervention Program, and that's a prevention program we continue to offer and facilitate across campus to this day. In addition to that program, we do a lot of programming and training across campus on relative issues. So if at any point in time you're interested in facilitating one of these programs, please feel welcome to submit a request on our website. We'd be happy to connect with your group. So all of that, good information. And now I want to touch on the reason why we're here this morning. I want to tell you a little bit more about Emily and a little bit more about her film. So the film we'll be viewing is called Unslut, a documentary. It's a crowd-funded film that's won several awards. And Emily is also the creator of the Unslut Project and author of Unslut, a diary and a memoir. The Unslut Project was inspired by Emily's own experience of being labeled the school slut at age 11 and being sexually bullied throughout middle school. Now a Harvard graduate and recent PhD, Emily started the Unslut Project by blogging her diary entries from middle school. Unslut, a documentary film, is currently being screened in settings like this one and at film festivals all around North America. Emily has been featured speaking out against slut-shaming on television and radio shows, including ABC, CNN, and NPR's Here and Now. And she has been featured in many magazines and blogs, including Women's Health Magazine, Glamour UK, and Salon.com. So with all that information in mind, I want to make sure we all know we'll be viewing the film, and then afterwards we're going to be engaging in a dialogue. Emily herself is going to lead a Q&A session, but I really encourage you to think about it as an idea exchange, right? As a chance to come together. So don't think of it just as a typical Q&A. Really feel welcome to engage with Emily, to engage with one another, to ask questions. That's what this program is all about. All right, sound good? Yeah? All right, there we go. There are the nonverbal communication skills. So without further ado, I would like to bring up Emily Lindin.
Thank you all for coming, and as Chelsea said, this is a really personal film for me. I always feel a little vulnerable screening it in intimate settings like this, and I think it will be clear why when we start to watch it. So I appreciate you all choosing to be here. I really hope that as you watch, you will think about things that resonate with you, maybe things you can relate to. If you disagree or if you've got other ideas, solutions in mind that might be applicable for this particular community, something I missed, something you want to get more in depth on, any of those ideas that come to you while we're screening this film in the next 40 minutes or so, I would love to hear about afterwards. So we have time for Q&A about, the process of making a film or crowdfunding or activism in general, what it's like to be a feminist activist right now if you're interested, but really about the content of the film as well, if there are solutions that you think weren't mentioned or if there is something that's shifted over the past 2 years since we started screening this film. Now is a great place to bring that up as well. So with that said, I think it would be great for us to spend the next 40 minutes or so thinking about those questions and enjoying the film, and then we'll have a Q&A where, as I mentioned, I hope it can be kind of a conversation and less of a direct back and forth between me and who's ever asking the question. So thank you all for holding space for that, and I am really interested in your reactions, and if any of you has any questions for me, I would love to answer them. I'm going to be a little later today giving a lecture delving a little deeper into some of the topics that came up, but now is a great time for us to have a conversation about it in a more informal way, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes, and I'm glad you asked about that. She asked about being a filmmaker, being a creative person who's telling other people's very personal stories, and it's a huge responsibility. This project started with my own story, which I have control over. Part of the purpose of starting the project was regaining a little bit of control, and it felt really good. I had a bit of a personal catharsis going back and reading through my middle school diary entries and putting them online. Maybe someone somewhere out there could get something good from it. But that was a decision that I could make. It's quite something else to sit down with someone who's never spoken publicly about something before and ask them to delve through again all of those most traumatic moments of their lives in front of a camera. And so for that reason, I was, in telling these stories, I was really thrilled to be connected with Ritea's parents, who were so interested in sharing what they had gone through from their perspective, trying to use this horrible tragedy as a way to prevent it from happening to other people by letting other parents know what they had gone through and hopefully reaching other daughters before something like this happened to another family. And so that is a really powerful motivator, I think, for a lot of people. With that said, in any case where there's a mediator between the general public and the person whose story is being told, that responsibility needs to be taken so seriously. I think in a lot of the Me Too stories that have been coming out, a lot of over the past few months since October of this year, one of the most crucial aspects has been the interviewer or the reporter or the journalist who's conveying these stories, their responsibility in getting all the facts straight, in protecting the victim who's coming forward. That's something that often gets ignored or pushed to the wayside. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is something that a really brave and scary thing still to come out and explain something like this that you've survived or gone through. And so, especially when it's in a public way, there is a huge responsibility.
You mentioned sex ed. Thank you so much, by the way, for this film. I was really happy to see it, the final product. I was one of your Kickstarter backers, so
You're
I knew about it
awesome.
a long time ago.
Thank you.
I was really excited to see it on campus. You mentioned sex education, and I'm curious what you think would need to happen in a country where we can hardly get beyond abstinence-only sex education. What do you think would need to happen for us to be able to include these messages of consent and really shift the way that we teach about consent and teach about sex education in our schools? What do you think is sort of the step toward getting there?
My answer to this probably is different now than it would have been even in the fall of this year. I think that now that a lot of kind of the weight and the consequences of silence is being dragged into the light in front of a public who didn't necessarily think that sexual harassment and sexual assault were problems that were everyone's problems before this point. I think that sex ed might be framed, and we could have some success in framing comprehensive sex ed as an alternative to accountability later, because as a preferable alternative, something we can do preventatively, the same way we might with any other public health crisis, to make sure that later we don't have adult men who are trying to figure out, should we jail them? Should we welcome them back into our families? Should they lose their jobs? We don't need to get to a point, we can kind of say for this generation, we won't allow people to grow into adults who are assaulting and harassing each other. We're gonna nip it in the bud with comprehensive sex ed. I think that is a little bit, kind of taking that tack, avoiding allowing people to kind of avoid a more uncomfortable reality by dealing with the discomfort of teaching kids about sex now. I think that honestly might be what we needed to push us a little in that direction. What are your thoughts? Do you have experience in that area?
Yeah, I'm one of the organizers of LexEd, which is a coalition here in Lexington to try and get comprehensive sex ed in our Fayette County schools. We're having a really hard time at the school board level at this point. And I'm a professor here on campus, and I study sexuality, sex education, and sexual pleasure in particular. So yes, I have had a little bit of experience, but I just find it so hard to get people past their lack of comfort in even talking about it. For example, the chairperson of the school board was really uncomfortable with even us just using proper terminology for genitals at the last board meeting, to the point where she got visibly upset and told us not to talk anymore. Wow. And so it's those types of people who seem to be holding sort of the gatekeeper positions to being able to get this change implemented that I just don't know how to get to them. Mm-hmm. And we've told stories of sexual assault in front of the board, even had people, testify who have been assaulted and the ways in which the education system has failed them, but that really doesn't seem to be working. So I don't know, maybe also not even calling it sex ed, like calling it consent education or developmental education.
Right. Asking it as something that's
a
little bit less.
Completely like eliminating sex from it, but just taking the sex in, like I do in all my grants.
what you've just mentioned is a really common and unfortunate tactic, but it's a practical one, which is, kind of framing these issues in ways that we really have to deal with all these varying comfort levels. And it's one thing, maintaining everyone's comfort in a conversation for the sake of it, but especially when you're trying to, on a larger scale, get policy passed, or on a small scale in a community, get a comprehensive sex ed program into a school, you need to run up against perhaps a principal who has not come to terms with their own insecurities about sex and their own lack of sex ed growing up. There are all these people who we kind of interact with on a day-to-day basis who haven't taken the responsibility, or it hasn't even occurred to them to evaluate their assumptions about what sexual violence is and what sexual consent is and what sex means to people, and the right that children have to learn about their bodies, and that we're really depriving them of when we send them out into the world to be, in some cases, to fend for themselves, and in some cases to have no idea where the line is between something they're consenting to and something that they're uncomfortable with or that's violent against them. What you're describing is a very common frustration around the country, and it's one that, unfortunately, I think needs community by community solutions. It's not unfortunate, but there's no one blanket solution because it is so specific to people's cultures. Religion plays into that, so does education in an area, and all different cultural factors, backgrounds, people's walks of lives. I think having the people in the community who live here and are a part of it and who have the consequences affecting them every day, who can go to gatherings, who can have conversations, who can really force the issue. If there are enough of us, we can work around people who refuse to examine their own biases or examine why they have discomfort, providing children with an education that we all as adults know they're going to need. Yeah.
Going off of what Kristen said too, like not including the name, like not calling it sex ed, sexual health is indeed part of our health as just as humans. And so when, like personally growing up, I grew up in Virginia, I didn't learn about sex at all. It was just like abstinence with it now. And then as you get older, but I learned like everything else about my health, like just in like my health classes, but sex was just excluded from that. And as you get older, you learn about it, but you don't really know anything about it, so it can become unhealthy to your body. And so it's like, I think if we like could focus on that aspect as like it's part of your health education and being healthy and well, and just as a human, as a person, and like physically, then we can move towards more of like what we're talking about here. But right now, it's not even considered like something we teach students even to stay healthy and be well as people, which I think is an overlooked topic that is extremely important. So
Agreed. That's a great way to put it. Another tactic I've heard that works, and I'm interested to hear your responses. So, as you were speaking, I like your approach much better. This one is a little fraught in my opinion, but I'd love to hear what you think. One particularly outspoken administrator had framed it to, she was interested in rolling out or I think incorporating some type of programming, and it didn't even require more funds. It was just a matter of convincing the parents and the school board and everyone who needed to sign on. And the way she framed it was, if we don't teach our kids about this, they learn it from porn. And if you don't tell your daughter what sex is going to be like, I'm saying this is the way she framed it, then the guys that she has sex with are going to have sex with her as if she's in a porn. And she's not going to know that it's not what it needs to be. She's not going to be able to advocate for what actually feels good for her. And that changed minds. And I mean, as a tactic, it's a little anti-porn, it's a little anti-sex, it's not there's nuances there that I wouldn't, advocate as a solution, one size fits all. But it worked in that community because the parents were so terrified at the prospect. If we don't provide accurate, correct information, they get it elsewhere. And that's kind of a moral panic phrase that's been circulating. I mean, I'm 31, and when I was young, I remember my parents saying, if we don't teach you in the home, you learn it from MTV. But now there's internet porn. It really is everywhere, in their hands, on their phones. I mean, there's no way to avoid it. And I think recognizing that, understanding how easy it is for us to access information online, our kids are even more, people who are native internet users are even more adept at finding what they want. Curious pubescent minds have always found what they're interested in. And so we are really doing them a disservice, this generation, even more so than our parents did us. by denying them accurate health information about how to keep their bodies safe as they become adults and healthy. I'm glad you brought that up. Those are really important points. Did anyone have any questions along those lines or something unrelated? I think I saw a hand in the back. Yeah.
Mine's more of a comment, but I appreciate the message that there's no statute of limitations on how you define what happens to you. With your story, you know, it happened in middle school, but it sounds like it wasn't till later, reflecting back, that you really understood the impact and how you redefined that experience. And I couldn't help but think of Monica Lewinsky, some of the news about what she wrote, I don't know if it was in Vanity Fair, it's an article, of how she's redefining what happened to her. You know, it was so touching to me to think, you know, here all these years ago, she was in her very young 20s, and to be able now to feel safe that, hey, this was an abuse of power, and, you know, the slut-shaming she experienced in front of the whole world, it's just, it's so tragic. And so I just wanted to make that comment, you know, that I think as we all think about what we've experienced, it's okay to redefine that. And it's nice if we can get support early, but once we realize how we're redefining that, we can still get support. So I appreciate that.
I'm glad you brought up Monica Lewinsky because she in particular is so inspiring to me. Have other people read this? If you haven't, I really recommend it. I think it was Vanity Fair. She wrote a wonderful essay just reflecting on the ways that she's changed, as you mentioned, and the way she, like her ordeal through the lens of the Me Too movement now, two decades later. And I feel so grateful to her for doing this for us. Like, she doesn't owe the country anything after the way that we collectively treated her, and she's taking this opportunity to turn such a horrifying, traumatic personal experience into something that other women can learn from. You know, if Monica Lewinsky can survive that, I can survive it as well. That's a decision that she's made recently. Just the past couple of years, she gave a TED Talk that I heard as well that I recommend. I think it's so powerful. It's an example, I think the most prominent example really in this country of someone using a very public moment in their life and reframing it, taking control over that narrative. And it's a model. It's a model that we can all follow on a smaller scale. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks.
Thank you again for this film. You know, I appreciate you sharing your story and allowing other stories to be out there. And of course, there's just a lot of heartbreak in there. I work at the counseling center, and so, you know, we work with students who were sexually assaulted on a regular basis, and even well-intentioned folks are shaming them. You know, I mean, parents on a regular basis mean well, but don't always handle things well. But I was just kind of struck by who's in the room today, and was just curious about the other times that you have shown the documentary. You know, who tends to come and who isn't there, and you know, I appreciate having I forget his name, the wrestler, and a couple other men who were you know, in your film and outspoken, and yeah, I think sometimes it's just disheartening that, you know, I appreciate everyone who's here, and there's a lot of reasons why people can't be here right now from classes and whatnot, but I guess I was curious about who tends to come to your documentary, and if it does tend to be kind of a percentage like this of women, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm glad you brought that up as well. I mean, so looking around, a lot of you guys all choose to be here because you're interested. You want to, you know, you can go forth, I hope, and be kind of change makers, or you see yourselves that way. I would hope. And a lot of film screenings we've done in communities and on college campuses are attended by people who are already on board, wanting to learn a little more, wanting to hear what their classmates and fellow members of the campus community have to say, and then go out in the world and like already are making this change. And I think these conversations are really important to share ideas and to hear from each other. With that said, we have screened the film. The first campus screening was over 2 years ago now at Lehigh University, and it was mandatory for incoming freshmen as part of their, and the programming. And so I think that it's just a different approach. I've shown it in high schools where we have an auditorium full of, you know, co-ed kids aged 12 to 18, which has been a little, people at that age are at different levels of what they are ready to talk about and understand. So I think some of my most heartening screenings and conversations following have been mandatory for college-age students, because I will get a lot of, straight athlete-looking dudes who come in with their hats, down over their faces. They don't even want to look at me because they think this is stupid and they don't want to waste their time. And then by the end of the film are, coming up to the mic in a Q&A and saying, I have a little sister. She mentioned this to me like 3 years ago. I dismissed her. I did this to her. Or sharing some other story that only happened once with a little sister, which was really meaningful. So those types of eye-opening conversations can happen as well. But I think it's honestly when people like you guys just drag along a friend who kind of thinks they have something better to do or doesn't think that it has to do with them. With that said, this film is online. It's really easy to find on iTunes, and so if any of you wants to, and I think actually you'll have it at your library when I leave as well. So sharing it, you can stream it through the campus streaming service I think you use here, and also sharing it outside of the campus community. You can easily just send an iTunes link to people who you think might be able to learn something from it. We've got a discussion guide online too, so that it can be kind of screened in environments where people might feel comfortable sharing their stories a little more privately, in a living room or one-on-one. Yes. But thanks for the work you do every day too, and for being here.
And kind of on what Mark said, as well, so like you said, most people here are kind of already, or hopefully kind of already activists and kind of trying to make the change. But for those people who aren't, if they can't come to the film, or even if you try to encourage them to do the film or whatever, what about more like on a smaller scale? So for me, I experience often socially, people will talk about their, not their body counts, but their body counts, as in how many people they've had sex with, and that is like, if you're above a certain number or not at a certain number or something, it's very shameful, depending on what you think is the right number or like too high a number or something. And I think that's silly. I think it shouldn't matter. So what I usually say is, it shouldn't matter, and that's whatever. But that's not enough for them. They just are like, okay, well, whatever. So that's kind of like my comment. So kind of a question of, what is something else I could say or like encourage, or I don't know, to be like, well, that is shameful, or I feel shamed because you said that, or you're shaming someone else because of their body count that is higher than yours or lower than yours or whatever. So how can I activate like encouraging thoughts or unslut
Right.
attitudes in my social circle that I'm constantly, and these are like wonderful people who have great intentions, but they just have this like set culture in their mind that's what they grew up with, and that's how it is.
Yeah, and so your tactic already, just kind of saying it shouldn't matter, dismissing it, works with some people, sure. With people who you are friends with and you don't want to sever your friendship, so this is like an awkward moment where someone who is not this evil misogynist MRA activist online sending you horrible threats, and you can just say F off, I never want to see you again. These people you need to see and maintain a relationship with. I always advocate calling people in instead of calling them out. Does that concept resonate? Some people are nodding. Calling people out is easy to do online, and it's pretty common. And it's also easy to do in life. I mean, sometimes I just lose patience, and if there's someone who's a friend of a friend or in a class with me and they say something that's completely out of line, I will call them out. But in these conversations, it's easier to call people in, and so one way to do it is to make it about them. That inserts a little bit of, it requires them to reflect, to be self-reflective, and it also inserts like a little thread of awkwardness where you're indicating to them this conversation they're trying to start with you about someone else is not going to be about someone else. If they want to continue down this line of conversation, it's going to be about them, and they're going to need to reckon with their own sexuality. Sometimes, if they're not ready to do that, or if that just feels icky and weird to them, they'll shut it down and just talk about something else. But sometimes you actually get there. So for instance, using humor can be really useful as well. I'll share an anecdote with you that worked in front of me among a group of my husband's straight friends. He's my husband now. At the time he was my boyfriend, so this worked for him because he did it in front of me. His friends were making fun of a girl that a handful of them had slept with. We were about, I guess, 22 or 23, and they had grown up with her through high school. So over the course of, 6 or 7 years, some of them had dated her, some of them had had sex with her, and they were making fun of her in a really gross way. And she was about to join us later that night too. So I was very uncomfortable. And I remember making eye contact with my husband and kind of thinking this is do or die. What are you gonna do? Because I'm your new feminist activist girlfriend. And if I'm you guys need to shut up, that's fine, but it will probably ruin our relationship. And also it's not gonna actually change their behavior. They're gonna be able to just dismiss, well, David's got a weird new girlfriend. Okay, we'll slut shame over here without her, So what he did, which really I think was effective and can be translated in other settings, was he kind of played dumb. He was listening around and then he was like, are you guys all really bad at sex or something? And they were like, what? No. He probably didn't use those exact words, but you know what I mean, do you guys suck at that? And they were like, I don't know, no. And he said, oh, so then she won, right? Because you guys got each other's sloppy seconds, but she got to have sex with all of you. Unless you're terrible, unless it was horrible for her, I don't know. And they were like, no, it was good for her. And he was like, okay, then she won. And it was complete, and they stopped. They were like, yeah, I guess we're making fun of her as if something negative happened to her because she had to have sex with all of us. But if we're good at sex, and this is a fun experience for her, then what are we even making fun of her about? She had fun, huh? And it really, in that moment, this was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I felt moved, I felt inspired because just accidentally, on a whim, my husband had found a way to stop his friends from slut-shaming this girl and to have them think about it and think about sex and what they were expecting from it, what it meant to them, what it meant to women, in a different way, if only for that conversation. But it stuck with me, I should say. It was enough for me to think, one, this is a topic I can't always handle on my own. It really does require people who are part of those friends groups, who are part of the community and part in the in-crowd that's doing the shaming or doing the ostracizing. It requires someone there to be brave enough to speak up. And I think all of us can be that person at different times, but using techniques that will allow you to keep your friends, allow you to move forward and actually have people change their behavior rather than just making them defensive or angry or shutting things down. I think finding a way to bring that up in a way that makes sense with your friends is the most effective. And for long-term change, I think the best way to go. Has anyone else had experience speaking up when they've seen slut-shaming like that? Saying something that's surprised them in the way that it's worked? Has anyone had experience speaking up and it didn't work? Yeah. What have you tried? Some people who are nodding, what have you tried? Or how have you witnessed slut-shaming here on campus, I guess, is a better question. What does it look like?
My students have mentioned it just in our teach the undergrad sex ed class, and I'll ask them about the difference between hooking up and sex. What is that? Let's define sex. And it's really hard for them to find the difference between those, but they base it on who the person is. And so they'll say, well, if my slutty friend says she hooked up with somebody, then I know she had sex with them. And so inevitably, that happens, that exact statement. And so it offers an opportunity to say, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? And why is that the way that you talk about that friend of yours, and why? And so we'll go into it. So I would say that is something that maybe works, but I'm their professor, so I don't know the extent to which that sticks with them. Yeah, so I think that it certainly happens on campus, obviously.
And starting conversations about it, however you can, is a great way to get people thinking. In the lecture that I give a little later, I'll put forward a few specific solutions that I've seen work in the past. One that is, clear and obvious and relevant to this conversation is personal story sharing. So when you're in a role of a teacher or an educator, it's not always appropriate to share something personal that's happened to you, especially if there's a layer of sexuality to it. Sometimes it's more than inappropriate, it could get you in trouble. But in situations where you have a mentor role and you do have the leeway to create a moment of connection with someone who's currently struggling, I really encourage you to take those moments and to find them where you might otherwise not have them. And what I mean by that, just to be frank, I'll describe to you what happens for me. People, might come up to me, and when I first started doing these screenings, I knew there would be questions afterward, and I had prepared myself. But there was really no way to prepare myself. For the first time, a high school student came up to me and took me aside and described to me how she had been raped by her stepfather and how upset she was about it and how she hadn't told anyone and there was nothing, that she felt she could do. And I feel like in that moment, the reason she felt that barrier was down was because I had just opened myself to her. She didn't know me. I wasn't, a role model to her. I wasn't in her community. She didn't have any reason to trust me at all, except that I had just shared something like that had happened to me. And so it's a way to build trust with people, especially across generations, who might think there's no way for someone in a different generation to ever understand what this feels like. I mean, we've all been there. We know what that visceral, you just don't get it, dismissal feels like. So if we can break that down, if we can take any steps toward breaking that down for someone who's currently in that box, feeling those feelings, I think personal story sharing is one of the strongest ways to do that. And it doesn't always offer the invitation right off the bat, but it lays the groundwork for later. If something were to happen to a young person in our life, a student we're working with, a child of our own, if they know, I remember her. She opened up to me. She told me she's gone through this. She will get it, even if it's years down the road. Laying that groundwork is one of the most important things, and modeling ourselves as people who can speak comfortably about our experiences, who decide not to blame ourselves, and who have lived happy, fulfilled, successful lives despite a crime someone committed against us, or despite a rumor someone made up about us. We're still able to kind of decide for ourselves what our lives look like. Seeing that is invaluable to young people who need to know that it's possible. Did anyone have any other questions about the film or about the project in general, or something you'd like to share? Yeah, answer.
Could you tell us the story about how Mick Foley became involved in this?
Oh yeah, I told this story last night, so I apologize if some of you were at that screening, but Mick Foley, did anyone recognize him, the WWE wrestler? Yeah, and someone mentioned, I loved having him in the film because he's such a guy's guy and he has that look about him that having a bunch of women's faces explaining why sexual assault is wrong is not bad, but it really adds something to bring men into the conversation if you have a talking head that belongs to someone like Mick Foley looking at you from the screen. I think it's effective. And so that's why I decided to include him in the film on camera. But his involvement in being, he ended up being the executive producer of the film, happened during our Kickstarter because we were fundraising. I needed $18,000 to start production of this film. And so on Kickstarter, if you don't reach your goal, you don't get any money at all, like zero. And so we had just a few days left, and we were at maybe like $14,000 or $15,000 and had a ways to go. So I was panicking, and I had already drawn upon everyone who owed me anything in life, who had contributed to the campaign, and I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, we just won't have the funds to make this movie. I'm gonna have to wait. And then I got a call from Mick Foley, who said, Emily, this is Mick Foley, and I didn't know who he was. So I looked him up, and the video that we included in this documentary, one of the reasons I included it of him, all bloodied and holding up his belt, is because that's the video that came up when I Googled him, when I had him on the phone, and he's slamming a chair wrapped in barbed wire around another wrestler, and I'm like, how are you calling me? First of all, why? What universe does that happen in? And second of all, what's your interest, in my film? And he said that he had been a volunteer on the online hotline for RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, and that he had spoken to so many women who, and people of all genders, who had gone through something, sexual violence or sexual shaming for something that had occurred to them in their life. They were traumatized by it, and he was so upset that he mentioned this in the film, everyone he spoke to blamed themselves, and that never sat right with him, and he didn't understand where that came from. He was speaking to there's a singer-songwriter whose music I love named Tori Amos, and she happens to be friends with Mick as well. And he said it was her who finally, motivated him, do something, volunteer, get yourself out there. And so he did, and volunteering made him more part of, on board with all this change we're doing. I think having him in the film really demonstrates that regardless of, what sphere or what world you belong to, this is an issue that can affect you. And in a really cool way, he offered to match donations the last few days of the Kickstarter until we made our goal. And so we did, we surpassed our goal, and all of the last Kickstarter donors, the last 100 or so, are just diehard WWE fans who gave money because Mick Foley asked them to. And that's really cool because, as you know, as a Kickstarter backer, every time we made an update, every time we screened the film for the first year or so, we would message all of our Kickstarter backers, and they're all on the Unslut project. They're all a member of our email list, and they all get updates and are linked to me on social media. And so there's now this diverse group. I think it includes a lot more guys than it would have otherwise, of people who are, were in at the ground level as part of this movement as change makers. So that was really heartening to me because it undid stereotypes that I have about the type of people who might be interested in promoting this film and putting their money where their mouth is and actually contributing $10 or $50 to make this film. That was really cool for me to see. Yeah.
Well, in addition to including lots of personal stories, you also include some historical images. And I thought that was a really interesting way to go about it. I'm an archivist and I work here at Special Collections, and so I'd really be interested in working with any of the professors here on campus or students in helping them incorporate historical ideas and images into their research and study about slut shaming. We're working on an exhibit on suffrage, and we're 100 years from this point, the brink of World War I. There's a ton of literature that was coming out on sexual hygiene as these men were being mustered in, 18-year-olds who had never taken a bath apparently in their lives and didn't know anything about sexual health. And so there was a whole effort towards sex education 100 years ago. And there was a lot of slut shaming of the suffragists. They had to be very careful with their image. There were actual misinformation documents out there that if we allow women to vote and to become part of the public conversation, they're going to become sluts and they're going to become something completely different. And so connecting young people today with these stories of women from so many other generations, and how this is part of a national narrative that's been going on, not just for the last 20 years since Monica Lewinsky, but for the last 100 years around birth control and women taking control of their own bodies and their own images before social media, well back into 100 years ago. So I think that imagery can be helpful to help students not to feel the personal connection, but to also be disconnected from it and see it on a level that's away from them, so that they can come back to themselves and back to their friends.
Definitely. You have such a unique insight then as an archivist with all that material. I'm so glad you shared that. I think something that's so valuable there too is that it undoes the knee-jerk reaction or the temptation that kind of the slut-shaming structures depend on, which is dividing women, which is thinking women of past generations were working against us or didn't have, understand, there's nothing we can learn from them. I think Dr. Ebony Utley put it well in the film, as long as there are bitches over there and sluts over there, then I'm safe. It taps into that as well. It encourages a solidarity across generations and actually internationally as well, across movements of figuring out and seeing, actually seeing the footage of the work that women have been doing, I think is so important. And that is why I included it. Honestly, a lot of it is available just on the AP, archive online, or you can, there are a few different archives where documentary filmmakers can access it, but I think having even, if there were a curriculum or something, the history of slut shaming or, in politics, I think would be wonderful for you to contribute to. That's great. Did anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? I did want to mention, along those lines of filmmaking and a project kind of having legs. You know, this film, we crowdfunded it in the summer of 2013, and so it's been a while. We've been screening it since, let's see, the fall of 2015. As I mentioned, the first school screening was at Lehigh, and these conversations have changed as well. Depending on the setting, depending on who's attending, obviously sometimes they're more intimate like this, sometimes, you know, they're a little bit more lecture style, and I feel they've shifted so that there's less of a shock that we're even having them, and that's something that might be heartening for you guys to hear, is that the idea that people might share their stories a few years ago was radical. Like the idea that at the time I was 28, as a 28-year-old woman, could stand in front of a group of people and say, 15 years ago, everyone thought I was a slut. People would gasp and think like, oh my gosh, isn't she still embarrassed about that? How can she say it? As if, you know, there was still wow, she's actually putting her face and name to that stigma. And it's funny because I don't really get that so much anymore. Obviously there's still harassment and backlash, especially online, but there seems to be an acceptance that women ought to be able to speak about these things. That assumed self-blame or self-responsibility for someone else's insecurities and the way that they lay them on us, that's in some ways just evaporating. Evaporating might be too hopeful of a verb, but it is, I do see steps being made to chipping away at that. And it's because of the work that people like you have always been doing. But I do think that it's because the national conversation has been moved forward, for better or worse. A silver lining is that it has been moved forward, and we're able to recognize that we have a voice and that it's important, how crucial it is. If we don't speak up about it, nobody hears it. If we don't speak up, if we don't claim our place at the table, it's not going to be set for us. And I realize now it's 11:35 and getting toward lunch, so you all might be hungry. But I did want to, just because we're in an intimate setting now, give you a chance if you had anything else you wanted to ask or offer in this group. I'm also going to be hanging out so we can talk one-on-one after, or I could see you at our lecture later today. So is there anyone else who wanted to offer expertise or a comment or question? If not, then we can go to lunch, and I'll see you all a little later. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for participating this morning. As Emily mentioned, we'll be back in this space at 2 to further discuss a lot of these ideas and concepts and look at how they're shaping the current national conversation. I do want to share that we have treats from breakfast left over, so please feel welcome to take some of that food with you. And I also wanted to mention that everybody who participated today will be receiving a follow-up survey by email. So I do encourage you to share your thoughts and feedback there. That feedback is invaluable in shaping the ongoing programming that we're doing. So we really appreciate you taking a look at that when that arrives in your inbox. Thank you.